Good morning. We have the privilege of having with us Fiamma Nirenstein, who runs our project on Europe and has done tremendous work on the Middle East, which this new book of hers, The Caliph and the Ayatollah, is just the latest product of. I think the book, which I read very carefully, makes an important contribution. First of all, it's a pleasure to read, highly readable English, and no, it's very important because you can get books that are, written in German grammar, and a little more difficult to get through. But also, Fiamma is a real master of events in this region, and you see her experience and knowledge come through in the book. As I'm sure all of you know, the threat of radical Islam to the Middle East and beyond has two dimensions. There is obviously a Sunni dimension, which has been in the headlines for the last 10 years, exemplified by the case of ISIS or Daesh. But the Shiite dimension has only recently become a focal point as the Trump administration has pointed out that Iranian expansionism is a very serious problem that has to be addressed. And of course, by taking on both of these challenges, Fiamma is somewhat putting into balance, a proper balance, the nature of the problem of radical Islam in our region. But we have also a great panel here to help introduce the book. We have Charles Small, who's actually the publisher of Fiamma's work, who's the director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. We also have with us Ruthie Blum, who is an editor at the Gatestone Institute, and she's a former senior editor at the Jerusalem Post. And everyone here is basically has enormous background in these areas and can contribute to a very good discussion. I will keep my words very short, but if there are questions later, I'll be glad to take them. Why don't we begin with Charles, then we'll move on to Ruthie, and then ask Fiamma to make the major presentation here, which is about her book. So Charles, why don't you begin?
I'm honored to be here, and before I start my comments about this important book, I'd like to acknowledge Mala Tabori, who's here, and among other important work, she does many important things here locally in Israel. One of the things she does is she's the director of our organization in Israel. She's the director of ISGAP. And I'm also traveling with a colleague, Professor Olufemi Vaughn, who's at the Wilson Center in Washington, and he's also a professor of African Studies at Amherst College, and is part of the ISGAP team fighting anti-Semitism and political Islam in the classroom. Femi does important work on jihadism in West Africa. So I'm honored that they're both here. And it was a great privilege and honor for my colleagues at ISGAP to have been able to publish this important book. And I think the book captures a lot of the work that Fiamma's done over the decades on an issue when you started that wasn't so popular and it wasn't on the radar of many people, even in the Jewish community and among policymakers. And Fiamma was really, I think, creative and relentless in making this an issue on the agenda of policymakers in the West and even in Israel. And I remember I was invited to an event in Rome, and this is about 14 years ago, and I was sort of blown away as a young scholar that Fiamma assembled a team of people to discuss issues of anti-Semitism and political Islam which included bishops and cardinals and
The parliament,
yeah,
you forgot to
yeah.
say in the parliament.
Well, there was one in the parliament and there was one in the Barbini, one of the monastery. So Fiamma was able to assemble very important people, key players within the church and within the cabinet of the Italian government and beyond. And these type of efforts Fiamma has been doing for decades, and not only had, I think, immediate impact on the issues, but also inspired people to understand what is possible. And I think Fiamma inspired more than a generation of scholars and policymakers into action. And I think the book is obviously very important. We were honored to translate the book from Italian. And it discusses political Islam in the Shiite community and the Sunni world as well. And the part that I found most important is sort of the West's ignorance and short-term perspective on the threat of political Islam, not just to Israel and the Jews, but to democratic societies and the sort of anti-democratic reactionary social movement that Fiamma so, I think, brilliantly examines. And I just want to say, I think Fiamma's role historically and in the current context, Italy is becoming, I think, maybe in a sense more important with Brexit. The Italian voice and the role Italy is playing in international organizations and in European matters is important. And I think Fiamma's role and her analysis, her constant presence is very important. So it was an honor for us to be associated with this important book. So thank you.
First of all, what's striking about this book is that, aside from what both Dore and Charles said, it is not only very readable, but it's lively. And this is a subject that doesn't lend itself to liveliness, but it is, I'm telling you, it's very lively and very evocative, because Fiamma doesn't skirt the issue of the bloodlust that radical Islamists have. In pornographic detail, and I think, we'll get to this a little later, I think that contributes to the West's both ignorance and fascination with it, this pornographic bloodlust. Another thing that's striking is that Fiamma wrote this book 2 years ago, the first edition of it, and when you read the new introduction, you can see how much has stayed the same and how there are flickers of hope for some change, some of which Dore has great familiarity with as somebody who has made overtures to the Sunni Arab world. Also, Fiamma dedicated this book to Bernard Lewis, her mentor. She's always called him her mentor. And Bernard died this month, sadly, so he didn't get to see at least the introduction to the English edition. But he read the original. He also could read 150 languages. And because of that, it was Bernard Lewis who in 1978, or when the Ayatollah Khomeini came to the news, came into the headlines in the West, and the West was describing him as this old nice guy, this cleric who was just, had no political ambitions. That was when the Ayatollah Khomeini was still in exile in France. And Bernard said that he was sitting in Princeton and everyone was talking about this guy, this nice old cleric. But he said, he wanted to find out more about him. And because Bernard could read Farsi, he said, I did what professors do. I went to the library and I looked up his book. And that is when Bernard understood who the Ayatollah Khomeini was, and he began to try to warn everybody else. And he wrote a piece for the New York Times, and the New York Times said, nobody is interested in some old guy in exile in France. Okay, so from that time to today, we see that Bernard, of course, was right. And as Charles said, Fiamma has been carrying that baton for all these years since then. And why I thought the book was so important was that for years, even Israelis, and Israelis not as much as Americans and Europeans, Israelis are less naive, but even Israelis spend many of the last years screaming about ISIS, 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 ISIS. And the reason was, of course, because of all those beheading videos. And, and they put on these great performances, although they were genuine. They weren't just performances. They were really slaughtering people on camera. And Fiamma goes into that in great detail in the book. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu was screaming, pay attention to Iran. Iran is a great threat. And the trouble is that because Westerners they can't understand who the bad guy is. That's the trouble in Syria as well. If ISIS are the bad guys and Iran is against ISIS, then Iran necessarily belongs to the good guys. This is a false premise, as Fiamma also pointed out, that you can't just pit one against the other. That's another thing that you might hear average Israelis say, good, let the Sunnis and the Shiites kill each other off and leave us alone. But as we've seen, even when they're killing each other off, they don't leave us alone, because that is not in their ideology or in their religion. And unlike Christianity and Judaism, both of which have moved into the modern age, Islam refuses to do so. Now, where the West is concerned, and you touched on this, Charles, that this book is striking because it shows how ignorant the West is. I think it's not only ignorance, it's willful blindness partly. It's there are fellow travelers and useful idiots. And that's right. And here's the thing that is so paradoxical to those of us who have been saying that we have to do something about these threats. Both threats, as Fiamma said, that we're caught in this vice grip between two threats, and they're also the same threat because they're not that different. Shiites and Sunnis aren't that different in their ideology, but what they certainly share is a desire to dominate, subjugate, and destroy the West. And they've been managing to do that not so much on the battlefield as at the universities, in Hollywood. They've been doing a pretty good job of it since, though they hate the West, and as Fiamma also pointed out, though they hate the West, they certainly were happy to adopt certain elements of the countries they abhor. Among those are Nazism and Stalinism. So they are selective in their hatred. They certainly are happy to use evil tools to, let's say, to achieve their goals. But this brings us to the issue of multiculturalism, and that is what is so hard for people like us to understand. How is it that multiculturalists say we have to respect other people's culture while completely denying the distinct culture of Islamists and of Arabs, of Turks, of Iranians? You ask an average American, what's the difference between an Iranian and a Turk and an Arab? You think he'll know the difference? Of course he won't. So on the one hand, it's we have to respect everybody's culture, and on the other hand, not to know a thing about it. And therefore, it's a little hard to defeat it when you're just reading the New York Times, let's say, and you're not reading Fiamma or Bernard Lewis. So I highly, highly recommend this book. Of course, there's always value. You know, people sometimes say, what's the point of singing to the choir? I have often over the years written pieces and people say to me, you're not persuading anybody on the left. And I said, well, that's not my job. I'll never persuade anybody on the left of anything. But it is helpful to people who agree with you but don't always have the arguments or know exactly why they agree with you. And that's why it's so important to read this book. Thank you.
it's true what you said, and you told the episode. I had a similar episode, even if I certainly don't want to compare myself to Bernard Lewis, as a matter. But as a journalist at La Stampa, I wanted to write a piece about Bin Laden. So that was before 9/11 and before many of his actions. And then I told my newspaper, there is this story about Bin Laden. He said to me, why don't you leave alone this poor pastor, the one with the sheep, how do you call it?
Yeah, shepherds.
These poor shepherds, these poor Saudi shepherds, you have a fixation about him. That was the way it was seen at the time. And I think that nowadays, about many subjects of this kind, there is still a similar ideology as I am. So you say that the book is very alive, and I thank you very much for that. The book is very alive because I was very angry when I have written that. I was a witness on the television, on the internet, of all of these incredible episodes that to me paralleled the horror that I felt during the Second Intifada. This I want to say right away because I've been here covering the Second Intifada. I have seen in Israel exploding, everything was exploding, you know as I know, Beit Cafe and the shops and buses with the children inside and old people in the streets. And the West was not able to raise its voice and to do anything. Okay, afterwards, I have seen this attitude toward terrorism growing until the paradox, because the paradox was just to see 12 people that were ordered just to bend on your knees in front of the sea. They come and cut all of their heads at the signal. Try to imagine how many take two, take one, take two they have done with their cameras before doing that. I tried to imagine that, and I thought about this. And it was really revolting. So I started asking myself, how can it happen? How can it happen? In the meanwhile, the parallel to this was the fact that the Massaw Matan with Iran was growing and becoming more and more important and going to a conclusion, while we had in memory all the terrorist attack of Iran. We could see its rush toward the atomic bomb, which was so clear to anybody that had eyes and ears. Only Mogherini could stay with his blonde head in front of the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Iran and smile to him. And this was really, to me, a scandal that I could not witness without getting it. So I started trying to understand what was going on over there from the two sides. Why do these people behave like this on one side, and on the other side, why aren't we reacting? So these are the two parts of the book. And now I immediately want to put you onward in something that is in my mind and continues to make me angry and to make me wonder, is the fact that in front of the incredible wave of immigration that Europe has to face, the Europeans don't know how to behave. They don't know how to behave. It's clear and evident to anybody that when somebody is sinking in the water, you have to hand him a hand and to pick him out and give him the first hand. That's quite obvious. But then afterwards, where must these people live? Who must help them? There are international law. There is a treaty which is called the Dublin Treaty. Everybody are asking themselves if it is the right way of behaving. When it is an Italian ship, the Italian ship is supposed to bring them to Italy. But if it is not an Italian ship, then it should bring them to the closest place. And nobody does it really, because when you are in front of these pregnant women and little boys and girls, then you find yourself flooded with people that you don't know if they are refugees, if they are... If they simply look for a job, or simply these are people that are dragged by this criminal organization or extremist religious organization into Europe for different aims. So here there is a question that has all to be developed, but it is in nuce, it's in nuce inside the book, and it's all connected to the problem of human rights and the West, human rights and the West. And inside the question of human rights, most of all, the question of terrorism. Don't forget that in 1982, United Nations voted a motion that says that when you fight against colonialism and imperialism, then you are allowed to use weapons. This way of looking at that kind of fight has been used several times, mostly for the Palestinians, mostly for absolving the Palestinians from their use of the arms, because they are fighting against an occupying, which is considered colonialist and imperialist. So that's one. But this idea of terrorism that never found a real definition in all the United Nations papers. You don't find the definition of terrorism. They were not able to find altogether a definition of terrorism. Is something that has been a terrible burden on all the fight of the Western world against terrorism and also against extreme Islam. So okay, so the first question that I put down, and it is why they are behaving like this. Well, they are behaving like this, they have been behaving like this for very similar reason, as Ruthie said. Either the Sunni and the Shiite have in mind that the only worth religion and aim is to give to all the world the gift of Islam. Islam must be given as the ultimate gift and form of government to all the world. This is absolutely in common, either to the Sunni and to the Shiite. So when you repeal the fact that they fight against each other, yes, they fight against each other until the moment that they are brought to face the West. When they face the West, then the aim is a common aim, and this is very important. And where are the bases of this? Either they are Sunni or they are Shiite. The bases are in the Quran. So I go through the issue, and it hurts, but it's true. So when something is true and it hurts, it doesn't deny the fact that there are moderate Muslims, that there are good Muslims. Far from me the idea that there cannot be a dialogue with. Recently, in our institute, we had a very interesting conference about a new book that we have by Dan Diker and some other scholars that says that the Palestinians are extremely angry with the BDS proposers because it's a big damage for the Palestinians. So on that basis, on an economic basis, they are ready to find an agreement. So what I can say is that, yes, there is sometimes a way to find a temporary agreement, but it will be always a temporary agreement, because what comes out very clearly from my studies is that at the end of the day, there is not the possibility. Of course, if you think different, I will be very glad to hear that. But there is no possibility of finding a final agreement with the world that thinks that they have to transform all the world into an Islamic world to make it perfect. So this is to make it possible, to make it feasible. That's the only way that they see it coming. So I go through all the story of how they organize themselves, and through all the story of how the West has been and is highly responsible for that. Of course, I go through all the Obama time, starting from the Arab Springs. The Arab Springs, which are still with us somehow, are at the origins of all the labyrinth that nowadays the Middle East has become. We are now in front of a completely different situation. Iran, thanks to the attitude of Obama, first and foremost, has been able to exploit its position after the agreement to become the most important imperialist power in the area. And this is what has happened. I give their numbers and times. I don't want to annoy it with it. You will find it. You will find everything in the book. But of course, you are aware of the fact that the experiments with ballistic missiles, the test to ballistic missiles that cannot have any other aim but to carry atomic warheads have been continuous. And also their experiment, and also the pretense of the IAEA that the agreement has not been violated is not certain at all. The opposite is true. It's much more certain that they at least 23 times tried to acquire new materials for implementing their nuclear program. That the Prime Minister of Israel has demonstrated to the fantastic discovery of the Mossad that has been kept in a secret place that became not so secret afterwards, and that demonstrate that the continuous line of behavior of Iran has really made it a very how does Trump says? He says it is embarrassing, very embarrassing for the United States. Nowadays, Trump has gone the way that Netanyahu has been defending and promoting with really an incredible courage all along these years, showing his face at the United Nations while everybody else was against. Now, Trump shows being a friend of Israel, mostly also with the Jerusalem issue, which was on the table also at the time of Obama. Don't forget that. Obama made a choice when he decided not to pass the embassy to Jerusalem, because that was already on the table since a long time. But of course, the real thing nowadays is Iran. Iran is hic Rhodus, hic Salta. This is something that Europe is slowly learning, in my opinion, so that even Macron and even Merkel, when they think about the future with Iran, say that in any case Iran must be obliged, even if they don't want to cancel the agreement, Iran must be obliged to change completely its point of view on the enrichment of uranium, and must never ever more enrich uranium. We will see. The strength of the European business with Iran is very strong, and also the opposition to Trump is very strong in Europe. So either the economic and the ideological side are tough, and also the fight against terrorism is tough, because if you read nowadays what's happening with ISIS, even if we are happy with the success either in Iraq and in Syria that have defeated on the ground the army of the Islamic State, still we know that there are many different organizations that, exactly like Al-Qaeda did when they went down into hiding and then came up again in 2011, taking advantage of the Syrian revolution. It was then that Al-Qaeda came up again. And I think that the ISIS can just do the same, because when you look at the way that they have lost in the towns in Raqqa, wherever they have lost, well, they did not oppose the enemy up to the very last man. If you look at them, you will see that they then have gone into hiding. They have started trying to eliminate the leaders of the tribes that are clearly opposed to them, and they mostly, even if they are smaller on the ground, still they spread their poison in Europe. and all over the world, so that the number of terrorist attack does not become smaller, is steady, and it's still there, So the war is not over on both sides. To win this war, and here so I can finish, to end this war, Europe must reconsider its point of view about human rights. Take Israel, for instance. Israel has rules in the behavior of its soldiers, which are all engraved in the book of Asa Kasher, that every soldier has to bring in his pocket. I have seen some of these little things that they take with themselves. It's really moving when you see that. What does it say, basically? That life is at the first point, but that you have the right and the need to defend your people. So I think it's something connected to the right of self-defense, as it is also the problem of immigration. Also the problem of immigration is connected to the question of self-defense. And we have to put all of these strings together to elaborate a new book of Asa Kasher for Europe, where human rights will be rethought. They must be rethought according to the very new and different revolutionary situation that we are in. And everything has to be changed. So with this hope for a change, I just stop and wait for your questions.
Migration, hijrah in Islam, is actually almost an imperative, because this is actually what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, made when he moved from Mecca to Medina. From a place which he was, from a birthplace in Mecca, when he was persecuted, almost killed, marginalized, and laughed at, he became a leader. He became a commander. He became a statesman, and he became a ruler. Definitely an upgrade. Since his behavior is the model for every Muslim, in every place, in every time, in every situation, how much would you agree to the idea that the migration to Europe today is actually following the orders and the example which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, set in front of his followers until the end of time? In order to become, from your homeland where you are persecuted, marginalized, almost killed, go to another place in order to become the ruler, the leader, and a statesman.
I think go ahead, because otherwise people will lose the questions. Go ahead and answer.
Now.
Yeah, sure.
Look, I think, Professor Kedar, that there is certainly something very important in what you say now. There is an avant-garde that is doing this just on this aim. And it passes all through Turkey, and not as a and not as a matter of chance. I think that we can be very grateful to Erdogan, because he kept the masses of the refugees, taking a lot of money from Europe, but he let many people go up and down, which are just the ISIS avant-garde, the Sunni avant-garde that he made friends with very easily, being him the boss of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is simply very connected. Now, I quote the Muslim Brotherhood not as a matter of chance, because nowadays what many scholars are taking note of is that Europe has become the conquering land of the Muslim Brotherhood, first of all. You find them everywhere. Before, it was Saudi Arabia that sent his clerks and his men to create mosques and schools and armed cells. Now Saudi has a second thought about it. It's not so convenient for them anymore, for many reasons that I don't want to examine now, but they are the same reason why the Saudi kingdom now became a better friend to the United States and to Israel than it was before. These are the reasons. While the Muslim Brotherhood, guided by Erdogan, has a completely different aim. Here comes Bernard Lewis that once said Iran will become what Turkey is, and Turkey will become what Iran is, which I always found very important, a little mysterious, but very interesting. One of the last things that Bernard actually said. And I think that you are right. There are groups on these boats arriving on the shores on these big waves where they succeed to go through them with the incredible danger from themselves, for their children, for their women. Still they do that not only because they are running away, but also because they are bringing something to Europe. And when they are there, they try to do it. And they discover them and they let them out because of the right of free thought. This is what happened.
Please, in the back.
Jeff Dalby, ZOA Israel Director. Fiamma, I'm just wondering, when you wrote the book, what was your target audience? Was it the general public? Was it scholars? Was it opinion makers? All of the above? And also, is there any intent to translate the book? And if there is, I would suggest starting with Spanish, given the behavior of the Spaniards currently. So if you could address those two questions, I would appreciate it.
When I wrote it, it was for the general public, and it was actually, it was very widely diffused and read. Still, it's true that maybe it was a little too much of a specialistic Middle Easterner eye. I think that the second part was the one that most made a great impression. I remember that the presentations in Italy were all punctuated by the people that were asking me, but what should we do? We cannot, for instance, when there is an asymmetric war, there is such a danger of hitting civilians while you're fighting that, of course, the Americans could not fight until the end. This war could not, because to beat ISIS was so easy. It was so easy. The moment when they decided they were going to do it, you just take some tank and you enter in these cities. But the point is that exactly like the Palestinians in Gaza, they did exactly the same. They hide themselves beyond women and children, and that's the reason why it took so long. But then at the end you win them. So the point is that with Hamas, this has not yet. It has not happened because they did not decapitate in front of the sea 12 persons. The moment when they would do that, and I suppose that they could easily do that. Myself, I'm sure this is my point of view and it's not shared by everybody. But I think that their ideology and their way of acting, their use of terror, look, the use of terrorism must be learned this because this is very important. Is the warfare that is written in the book of Islam. It's written. It's a group. It's part of the history of Islam. Terrorism is something that has been used since the very beginning. You just go with a group and you kill everybody. You find it in so many religious and historical texts, something that is part of the antiquity, yes? But while the West has, because also the Jews went and killed everybody, kill also the children of Amalek. Then we don't do it, and but still the order was that. But then just in the centuries, exactly what we have learned is that you cannot do it. You cannot do that. Now, when you have a reproposal of the ancient Islam exactly as it was, and this is what ISIS did, they presented themselves exactly as they were. Same hair, same clothes, same beheading, and same cutting of the hands and whatever. The Sharia in its extreme form. By the way, also Iran has a Sharia in its extreme form. They still have stoning.
Translations for the Europeans?
It's in Italian, and I will be delighted to see my book translated in other languages. For sure, the one that would feel it as a problem more are the Spanish. You're right, the Spanish, but also the French. The French are the one maybe that are the Belgians.
Greer.
Please.
Given the mindset of political Islam and the imperialistic ambitions of Iran and the nuclear power and the right of the West or anyone else under attack to defend themselves, when do you anticipate the Third World War, and how much of the world will be left?
Well, I will quote the Pope now, that says that the Third World War is already happening. And if you look around, actually, you see many places where it is taking place. I'm certainly not in the position of wishing or desiring a Third World War. I think that what is happening today is quite enough. It's quite enough, and we have to stop it, not to implement it. To stop it. And to stop it, sometimes when you have to stop a warfare, you need another warfare. That's it. Just to stop it.
I'll just throw in a little observation, and that is, if you stand strong now before you get to that point, you never will get to that point. But if you don't, then you're going to face all of that kind of apocalyptic scene that you were hinting at. Actually, you were rather explicitly stating. Chaya.
Question to Fiamma. First of all, congratulations on the book, Fiamma. As always, you do a wonderful job. I have a question, because, when we look at Europe today, what we're asking ourselves is Europe lost? What do you think? What can happen? What should happen to turn the tide? Can anything be done? Because you talked about the willful denial of Europe, that Europeans are not willing to understand what is going on, to actually cope with the situation. Some countries already understand, like Hungary, like Italy. The question is it already too late? What do you think?
Look, actually the numbers say that it is not too late, because I looked just this morning, just to make sure that I'm not saying stuyot, and I have seen that the numbers are not so very high. I mean, Italy has an 8% of foreign presence. I'm speaking about immigrants, while the highest is 12%, 13% is Austria. It's not that terrible, as you said, Dore. Now, if you stop it, it won't become too much. So how do you make it not become too much? There is echo, and here comes your question. Europe is just discussing very toughly, and not in a nice way, because what happens then, the people that try to discuss the issue are accused to be fascist, to be Nazi, to discriminate. Well, sometimes it might be that some of them are fascist. Fascists exist everywhere, just like communists. And but still, the discussion is very real. Is very real. And actually, what is coming up are proposals. Proposals, for instance, now I find it very interesting, and everybody share it in the European Union. A proposal of hotspots. What is a hotspot? It's something that must decide before they leave their countries who can live and who cannot live according to the international laws. Are you persecuted? Yes. Then you have the right to be received as a persecuted person, because otherwise they kill you, or they kill your children, or they kill your wife. So of course you must have the right to run away. Do you want a new job? Well, here the question becomes more complicated. Have you got somebody that can give you a new job? Do you know somebody where you are going? Just as they do when you go to the United States. Now they ask you, where are you going and what are you? So now these hotspots should not be in the place where they arrive, because otherwise, before that, there happens all of this balagan that nobody knows who must receive them. The nearest port or the port of origin of the ship that picked them up from the sea. So the hotspots must be in the place where they want to emigrate from. In Libya, that's the first place. Basically, the idea is to keep them there where they start from. Until today, this has been done in a not very nice way. And I must say that, for instance, take Italy as an easy example for me. The Minister of Security that has done that is a leftist, very leftist, even more leftist than Renzi and then was. But he kept them in Libya with using force, not use, which means they are going to the shore to try to catch these boats. They stop them and they make them wait in camps. I don't want to say worse than that.
Say detention.
In detention, but they're camps because they don't have houses. And who are the ones that are used to guard them? Are the people that has been used to be their the one that takes them on the boats to
the escorted.
They're minders.
No, the traffickers.
They're the ones guarding them.
The traffickers. These are the ones that guard them.
Excuse me, Fianna, I have a question.
Please.
You,
Fiamma with
Fiamma.
2M means
Secha,
flame.
Fiamma. You and Federica Mogherini, who I could pronounce better, unfortunately, have two things in common: your gender and your nationality.
Not only this, we were in the same commission in the parliament for a long time. I know her very well.
Okay, so you're partly preempted me because I'm curious about a contact you had with this woman who I find totally insufferable. And she, I mean, the only nicest thing I could say about her, you probably agree with me, that she's sort of a puppet of some of those characters in Brussels, because she's a complete imbecile, in my opinion. But and you know, she makes a point right now of being wed to the JCPOA. You know, and it's very, very discouraging. Would you add to what I'm talking about here from your experience with her?
Look, so let's allora, for sure, Europe nowadays, its official position is we are in favor of the JCPOA, and we won't leave it, whatever Trump will do. But under the ashes, there is a lot of fire, you know, because there are many people that understands that a country that sends its soldiers to fight in in Syria, that possesses Iraq, fights with the Houthis, gives money to the Hezbollah, to the Houthis, is present everywhere. There is an imperialistic operation in the Middle East, and that hangs homosexuals and puts in jail whoever thinks different, and slashes women that don't wear the hijab. Well, everybody understands that, right? And also, Europe was very Obamaized, just as Obama was Europeized. Obama has been the most European American president that I have ever seen, and the opposite. But this is changing, you know.
Javier Solana was denied entry to the United States because he visited Iran. How many European politicians will prefer Iran than going to the States? If anyone who goes to Iran cannot go to the States.
No, I think that the answer is in your question, but still, I also want to say something. Mogherini bases her only power on one thing, which is the one that has brought all the European states to vote all the time against Israel. Unity. Unity is the sacred cow of Europe, okay? It's the only thing that is there, because you don't know unity about what. Nobody knows, because each of these countries thinks completely different and has completely different interests from one another. Still, unity is... Now, Mogherini won't be able to find unity on these themes. All the Visegrad countries are not anymore on her side, and it's becoming hard to stay on this position. There is somebody over there. It's a long time that he asked. Israel Medad.
A good few years ago, I was very friendly and in correspondence and communication with Sheikh Palazzi from Italy. Number one, I haven't heard from him for a while, so if you know anything, I'd like to know. But the point is there any hope for any moderate Muslim voice in Europe? Is there any possibility for him to develop both from his community and draw attention from without to create some sort of middle ground? I mean, I'm also with Mordechai on the bad news vision, but at least to ask, is it at all possible that something middle ground could develop?
Well, maybe I'm not a very good source, you know, because my belief in dialogue is very small. Unfortunately, I prefer to study things that come to the surface instead of the one that are under. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but as far as I can see, there is not much. There is not much in sight. Still, if you like, I will ask. Okay. First of all, about Palazzi, that I know, and is a very kind guy, very, very kind guy. As I wouldn't say a friend of mine, but somebody that I know quite well, and I met several times. We even spoke together in several occasions.
Hello, my name is Dr. Nan Greer, and I'm with the University of Redlands in California, and I also work in Indigenous land rights documentation. One of the things that we struggle with in the classroom is, as anthropologists teach cultural relativism, it's an acceptance of virtually all human behavior, while at the same time looking into international human rights law, it's anything but. We've had to use this as a moral compass to decide what we like and what we don't like. For example, the issue of child soldiers being something against international human rights law, and yet we have many even leftist organizations like Amnesty International supporting this, even though they say they support human rights. So I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about the future of human rights and what might be the need for entering into a better system for international human rights law that is at the same time respectful of others?
Look, in the book there is a part about it, and I will say very, very, very briefly, just summarizing maximum. Multiculturalism and globalization has brought polygamy, female mutilations has brought again a lot of
honor killing.
a lot of honor killing, and yes, anti-Semitism, of course.
Please go ahead, follow up.
Maybe a second part to this question is, as an educator, I want to educate my students about these problems, and yet I'm almost at a point where I might lose my job just because I'm speaking about it.
Well, yes, but I think that even here we are at a turning point. The wave is growing because it has become. You know that in Paris there are something like 500,000 people that lives in polygamic families. I think that in New York it's the same. Now we don't. I think so. Yes, polygamic family. Charles.
So I wanted to push back a little bit against the critique of multiculturalism. I was a student of Charles Taylor, who was an advocate of multiculturalism.
Please.
And I think I would argue that multiculturalism in its conception in a democratic society creates spaces. There's the private sphere in which people have more rights to do things according to their worldview. There's the sort of middle sphere, public institutions like temples where people have more leeway to practice their religion, but within the laws and norms of a democratic society. And then there's the public sphere, where you have to adhere to a democratic society. And I think multiculturalism, in theory, is a very important model to integrate people into democratic practices and beliefs. However, I think there's an ignorance in sort of this postmodern moment where people are not engaging the policy of multiculturalism, the philosophy of multiculturalism as it relates to democracy, but are sort of using this postmodern ideology that sort of everything goes and we have to respect every narrative. And there are some narratives that are anti-democratic and reactionary, and those are the narratives that we have to confront.
See, so I mean, there are laws, no, in a democratic society, and to me, is absolutely enough to respect the laws. I don't want to go further. It's enough. You must have one wife and one husband, but no, you cannot have 2 or 3. But
Let me just add.
but
The West have to accept other cultures, but they don't have to accept the West.
exactly, you're absolutely
No, in
right.
fact, the big disappointment for Europeans was that when they accepted in large Muslim minorities into their countries, they expected the Muslim populations to take on certain fundamental aspects of Western civilization. But that didn't happen. And in fact, large areas of Berlin, of London, have been self-ghettoized and are not blending in with the majority culture, and that has political impact. I would also add one other thing. In terms of the commitment to violence and jihad, you know, there's the famous statement by the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who says, "We will conquer Europe, but not with jihad, but with dawah, which is spreading the faith through preaching." But the preaching that they are doing is contains elements that bring you into total cultural clash with European civilization. So that still is a fundamental challenge that nobody has spoken about. And if you get large populations moving into Europe who are committed to spreading the faith, a la Yusuf Qaradawi, then Europe's going to have very, very big problems. I think one of the things that that Fiamma is talking about is it's not so much a battle with human rights, it's recognizing that this is the current challenge and an increasingly growing challenge for European civilization as these waves of immigrants become a far more pressing problem.
I just want to add something also to that, and that is there's this combination of dawah and demography in Europe, because maybe the numbers aren't so huge as you said, like optimistically. The trouble is Europeans are not having children, and Muslim immigrants are having children. And even those who actually came to Europe to get a better life for their children, there are stories of people who moved to England, Scotland, and put their kids, they had their children in Scotland, put them in private schools. They wanted them to be educated in the West from Pakistan. And then the kids went to the local mosque and became radicalized, much to their parents' dismay, actually. So if you're having huge numbers of people being indoctrinated in the mosque and in the schools and some after-school programs, and you have so many of them, and Europeans are not having children, that's a real problem.
Yeah. Jonathan Bora, first, thank you for your insight. It's quite fascinating. Do you have any comments about how this would apply to the American situation, which is different and complex? But you hear some of the same key words. We aren't finding Muslims coming in from El Salvador, but something is happening. If you have any comments or any of your own insights would be much appreciated.
About the United States, it seems to me that nowadays, considering the several episodes of terrorism, the episode is not so much connected to a social situation as much to a problem of public order, no? To terrorism. I wouldn't say that nowadays the problem of the presence of Islam and Muslim in the United States, it's something that you can consider a problem. I don't see that. Dore, is there a problem? I don't see any.
Wouldn't you agree to the
See?
Moti,
No, in the meaning, but not in the numbers, I would say. The numbers.
Wouldn't you agree to the assertion that actually the United States is like 15 years behind Europe? Because what you see today, especially with the activity of Muslim Brotherhood organizations on the soil of America, North America, means both Canada and the United States, it is more or less actually what you saw in Europe like 20 years ago. So if the Americans, let's say, fall asleep on God, the Atlantic will not be wide enough to keep America away from the problems of Europe.
No.
In a time phase of difference of 20 years. And 20 years in history is nothing.
In general, there is a problem. There is a big problem with Islam. I'm really sorry to say that. You know, when I say this, but see,
the attempts to portray
it's true.
Islam is another good, peaceful, nice religion. It is exactly what happens today in the States, what you heard in Europe 20 years ago.
Right.
And you see that the shut eyes of especially the previous administration to, you know what, I can give you an example from my own experience, what I heard from somebody. I met a man who lived in Florida, and his brother is a lawyer, and he was working for the Homeland Security Department as a lawyer, preparing files to court of illegal immigrants. One day, like 4 or 5 years ago, they got an order to dismiss and to close all the files which bear names like Muhammad, Mahmoud, Mustafa, Fatima, Abir, all these Islamic names. An order which came upon them from above. Thousands of files were shut immediately, only because of this order. And against Antonio, Javier, and all the others, they continued, the procedure to deport these people. Okay, and this order came upon them from somewhere up there.
Tzvi Mazel is going to be asking a question right now. Ambassador Tzvi Mazel will be asking a question now.
Excuse me. You explained very well. I have already read your book. Really, it's a wonderful, it's a good presentation of what's going on. And, and you said that in Europe they don't understand or they don't want to understand. That much we know. It's a problem. It's very difficult to tackle it. But the same thing now is happening in the United States, because quite a maybe not the majority, but a good part of the Democrats have gone in the same way as Europe. And so that's the problem, because if you put together the Democrat Party and the European left, it's a force. It's very difficult to do something about it. I mean, we have to fight on the level of ideas, but it becomes more and more dangerous and difficult to deal with the problem. You see, and while from the other side they continue, as Professor Kedar said, they are now the most extremist organization trying to imitate Medina. Medina was the first Islamic country. So, and this is the example. So I mean, we are in a problem, in a very big, and now above all of it, you had Turkey. Yesterday, Erdogan was elected as the real dictator of that country, and he's opening in Turkey dozens and dozens of Islamic schools, and that's a problem. And they are studied to love jihad and to protect the new Islamic Turkey. I take it from Turkish press. So it's a big problem. It's a very, very difficult problem how to tackle all this. That's what I wanted to say.
I agree with you. There is nothing I have to answer. I mean,
somebody in the back who was speaking before.
Yes.
Okay, Eliyahu Green. I'd like to mention to Fiamma that just this morning it was reported on Israel radio that one of the Ayatollahs running Iran congratulated Erdogan on his victory in the election, yesterday's election. Exactly. Now here you have the Sunni power and the Shiite power, or the Shiite power is congratulating the Sunni power.
Absolutely.
Now, what does that mean to you? What does that signify to you? And what do you think might come out of it in terms of action or practical events?
Well, first of all, it means something about Syria, because you know that having had Erdogan a very bad relation in the past with Assad, he has been changing his attitude according to the different situations that were showing. So, I mean, this is a message about, it's certainly a message also about this new friendship. But more basically, this is also a proof of all the theses that I try to develop in the book. There have been times, and it has been written many times, that Osama bin Laden was in hiding in Tehran. That was something that has been repeated and repeated. I cannot testify if it was true or not, but certainly it's a very important. It's a very important story if it is true. The two of them have an enemy. The enemy is the West. The enemy is the West. So nowadays, Erdogan, as he is certainly showing a much less and less with the passing of the year, secular attitude that made Turkey in the past a very desired ally to the West, because it was a Muslim state that could serve as a bridge between the West and the Muslim world. Nowadays, this is passé. It's no more there. Erdogan the bridge collapsed. Erdogan is very angry at Europe because Europe refused him. Germany, Netherlands. See, he has a very strong weapons of blackmail in his hands, which are the refugees, because he has got a lot of euro to keep the refugees in Syria, but he has always been threatening, look, if you make me too angry, then I will let them flood to Europe. So
Charles, you have a comment?
Yeah,
Yes,
just a
please.
quick comment. So there's a long, as Fiamma knows, there's a long legacy of Shiite Sunni Islamists being supportive of each other. I think the regime in Iran pays homage to the Muslim Brotherhood, to its ideology and its intellectual contribution to Islam. And I also wanted to say, you know, the founding director of Islamic Studies at Oxford University said famously in public and repeated it in public that all true believers of Islam must finish the work of Hitler. So who is the founding director of Islamic Studies at Oxford? It's Yosef Kawadawi.
Yeah.
So while we focus on political Islam and the problem of Islam religiously, philosophically, I think we also have to look at how the West and Western institutions and Western governments actually propped up for money and for power a very sort of narrow segment of the Islamic world. And the West benefited, or institutions benefited, and had a very, I would argue, a very short-term view of history and of politics, and sort of kicked the can, and continue to kick the can down the road by supporting political Islamists in the Sunni world and the Shiite world, and even in European communities. If you look at committees and organizations set up by government officials in Europe, they're propping up the Islamists in London, in Paris. And this type of support of Islamists within Europe and even in the United States has to stop, and we have to promote Muslims who are, I would say, more accepting of otherness and of democratic principles.
I think we're going to come to a close now, and I just want to make one observation. I wouldn't want this meeting, which allows us to really accept the warning that Fiamma is bringing to us, to turn into an anti-Islam festival. I'm just reminded of when I used to have a lot of, let's call them, behind-the-scenes meetings with our neighbors. I remember asking them, well, where do you want to have our follow-up meeting? Should we meet in Europe? It's very convenient. You know, Rome is, or Paris are equidistant. And I remember a rather senior individual from a Middle Eastern country saying, we're not going to meet in Europe. It's too dangerous. They're crazy there. In other words, there have been these
That's nice.
permutations of Islam that have occurred in various seminaries in Europe, where extremism has been fostered, so that certain European Islamic offshoots have become the new threat, the new danger. And the first ones to recognize that are the Muslims themselves. So we do have to give a more moderate Islam, which I believe does exist, a more pragmatic Islam, a chance. But we have to wake people up to the nature of the current threat against all of us. Radical states, radical Islamic movements are penetrating everywhere around us, into Africa, into North Africa, Maghreb, into, of course, large parts of the Middle East, and now, of course, with the immigration waves into Europe. And in Europe, they are growing. We have to do what Fiamma's doing and carry on what she's set out to do, which is to warn people about these emerging trends. And when these trends become coupled with two forces, one, the force of global terrorism, and the other, weapons of mass destruction, this is the threat to our security. Not just Israel's security, security of the entire Western alliance. So I want to really thank you, Fiamma, for bringing up this warning in your book. By its very title, it points to the fact that this is not a threat of one branch of Islam only, but both branches are susceptible to this radicalization. And the real danger here is complacency and denial. And that's what happened. That's what allowed the Iranian version to get started back in 1979. And it has allowed the growth of the various Sunni versions that have dominated the threats that we all face since that time. So thank you again, Fiamma, and read the book.